Yeah, well, I think he can be one of the best centers in the league. And I think he's shown that at times throughout his career. I know he showed it when we played him in the playoffs a couple years back, and he shot about 80% from the field, and deterred every drive, every cut, every effort to attack the basket. He can be a big-time deterrent, and there's still areas that he can grow offensively. But I'm intent on really connecting with him and restoring him to an all-star level player.
I love it. Again, I think I was talking about this in terms of his trade value. Like, it just takes one person to see potential and to think that they're the ones that can change them around. And if you already have that person in the fold, and it's easier to work with what you have than try to make moves to work with something that you don't know is out there. So in terms of trying to restore DA, I think that's a great way to phrase it, because he's going back to 2021, where arguably DA had his best playoff season. And I don't think that's really an argument, like he just did. And he's trying to get the most out of him and go back to that point, because if DA plays like that, then he could be an all-star. And DA is very much fallen off of that level, especially this year, as a significant drop from where he was, especially in the playoffs. So I love the fact that he said restore him, because I do feel like there's also, just using that word, right? I think restoration, we talk about it in a physical sense. And I think for this, in DA's case, is more mental than anything else, because he has the physical abilities. I don't think that's undoubtable. But mentally, something has happened in terms of the way DA thinks about the game, or even has a passion for the game, that he just lost in the middle of the Monty Williams era. And I don't know where it went wrong. And I hope that Frank Vogel can kind of restore that back in him, and so that way we can get the most out of DA, because that's, to me, it's the mental aspect of this that's the vital part, and that's where the communication comes in.
And I think, honestly, with Frank Vogel, this is the thing that intrigues me the most, because last week when we had Anthony Irwin on as a guest from the LA perspective, right, one thing he did point out was what Frank Vogel was able to do with Anthony Davis. We've all talked about how Frank Vogel has a knack for working with bigs in this league, right? So if Deandre Ayton remains on this Suns squad, then he's in good hands with Frank Vogel. If the Suns decide to move on from Deandre Ayton and go the route that we've talked about over the last couple of off seasons too, of bringing in a center who can do 70% of what Deandre Ayton can do, well, then hopefully Frank Vogel can also maximize that guy as well. So best case scenario here, whether DA is on this team at the start of this next season or not, you have a guy who is really good at working with bigs. So whether it's restoring DA or getting the most out of somebody who is replacing what Deandre Ayton brought, best case scenario.
Right. I feel like when I asked him about his defensive mindset earlier in the press conference, he had mentioned like it starts with the big fella. He feels like he has a defensive scheme that is the best in the league, but it really helps when you have a shot blocking big, and he's had tons of elite rim protectors in his time. Roy Hibbert back in Indiana, he had a year of Miles Turner, then goes to LA. He has Anthony Davis. He's got Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee. Like, he's played with these rim protecting bigs that are kind of the centerpiece of how his defense functions. And DA is going to have to be that. And he hasn't been a rim protecting, shot blocking kind of big. He's been a rim deterrent before, a much better one than he was this season and even a little bit last season. So like I said, if he is still on the roster coming into next year, you have the right coach that if he can't get DA to be locked in defensively on a consistent night in, night out basis, then it is what it is. And that's the time to cut bait. So you're really hoping that, like Saul said, this is the guy that can restore DA, but part of that is on DA to restore himself as well. And I think maybe a change of voice will help with his confidence in that regard. Maybe that'll help coax that side out of him that we saw during 2021 when he was probably the most consistent player. He wasn't the best player during that playoff run, but he showed up every single game in those playoffs and played really well. So hopefully Vogel is that guy if he's still on the roster.
Yeah, what struck me in the quote was more I'm intent on really connecting with him. DeAndre Ayton in particular is a guy that seems like he truly needs somebody that connects with him and believes in him to get the most out of him. And the rumors we heard were after those finals, Monty Williams kind of soured a little bit, and over the next season and a half, it continued. Whether DA is here or not, this is the kind of approach I want a coach to take to his roster. Because as we were talking about earlier, if I truly connect with you, you're going to want to fight harder for me and what I'm trying to get you to do. And as a coach, that's imperative. If that trust isn't there, if that's broken, it becomes much more difficult to get them to follow the game plan, to get them to believe in what you're selling. And that's how you wind up with a fractured group. And I think we may have seen some of that last season. So I really hope that Vogel can do that with DA and beyond on that roster.
I think that there's a bit of empowerment here that I don't know how much Monty empowered DA to do certain things. And because he definitely did that with Chris and Devin. And I think as a player, especially after you've been in the league for 4 or 5 years, after you get the max, and really the way that max was handled, even the fact that Monty allegedly didn't even say anything to him about getting a max. Like, I think DA craves that. He wants to be given that empowerment to a certain degree. And I don't think you should give him the whole farm, but I think he looks for that and he wants some validation. And I don't know if he got that necessarily from Monty all the time. I know he did at first, the first 2 years, and we heard it behind the scenes. They had mic'd up and against the Bucks, and he was talking to DA, and that was a beautiful moment because you see somebody that's struggling and he's trying to get him out of it, and it worked. But I don't know what happened after that and if it continued or not. But it feels like it didn't.
Yeah. And DA, I think, is just based on the way we've seen him respond to certain challenges, like the playoffs, that 2021 run. It was Anthony Davis, Nikola Jokic, Giannis in the finals. Like, he's a guy that constantly responds to challenges. He responds to routine stimuli. Like, he's a guy that needs something put in front of him that needs to be called up. And I think after a certain period of time, it probably got a little grating to continue having to put the next carrot or the next objective in front of him. And you kind of want him to kick it into overdrive himself. So I think that might be the challenge for Vogel. But like I said, maybe that change of voice is going to be enough. Maybe just that will be enough to have DeAndre take it upon himself to be the defensive anchor that he talks about being a lot of the time, because that's what the Suns need from him the most. There's always this talk about DA's touches and his role on offense and all this stuff. But when he just does the little things, he's going to get his on offense. If he defends and it starts on that end, then the Suns are really in business, especially under a coach who has been, he's led the top defense in the league 3 times, top 3 defense 5 different times in his career.
I get what you're saying about having to keep putting that carrot out there, but at some point that's leadership, that's management, that's what's expected of the job, because some people are just wired that way. And you can't expect everybody to find that self-motivation or find that thing. And the best coaches, the best leaders find a way to lead each individual and personality type. Sometimes I think Monty probably struggled with that, because as we talked about, if you were Monty's guy, you were Monty's guy. But if you weren't Monty's guy, you were on the outside looking in, and they need a guy that can manage all the different types of personalities.
Well, and we've heard that about Frank Vogel, right? He's had experience managing superstars. He's got 2 of those on this squad. I'm not too worried about him connecting or finding a way to work well with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. But you also need a guy who can reach everyone else on this team. And it seems like Frank Vogel has at least had good experience and a good track record with working both with superstars and then everyone else on the squad. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that all shapes up. But I did like what he said. I want to see it in action, but I like what he said.
Also, people in the chat, they're like, Ayton needs to grow up. Ayton needs to grow up, blah, blah, blah. Ayton needs to grow up. He needs, there is accountability on DA's part for sure, 1,000,000%. But you know what? I'm gonna just say it like this. I'm gonna take it from the known to the unknown, right? We don't know what's going on behind the scenes with Ayton, right? But I've been married 3 times. And you know what? The third time, the person that I had that third time was able to communicate with me in an effective way to get the very best out of me. So it's not always just about growing up. Sometimes you just need somebody to relate to you a little bit better to be able to get the very best out of you.
Yeah,
and
and
that's
put
okay.
put those goals.
Communication.
Yeah.
I'm just
But
saying.
effective communication.
Effective
That's
communication.
the thing.
And love
You can
languages,
communicate,
right?
but if you're not making sure that whoever you're communicating is understand what you're saying, then you're not really communicating.
I know this sounds cheesy because you laugh when I say the love languages, but
No,
that's
but you're
understanding
not
what
wrong.
what
It's true.
motivates human beings,
Yeah.
and that's the key to leadership and unlocking people is what motivates you. And that's not saying Frank Vogel has to handhold DA every step of the way. You connect with him and you put the goal out there in front of him and you hold him accountable if he doesn't reach said goal.
Yeah.
And that's the way to go about it.